Anyone not heard of John Singer Sargent? No, we're all painters, so of course we have. John Singer Sargent was late 19th, early 20th century, known mainly as a portrait painter, but that was about a third of his output. His output included decades of murals that can be seen in the Boston area, innumerable landscapes, watercolors, oils. That's something he started out doing with his mother as a preteen. And they have sketchbooks of little 11-year-old John Singer Sargent, Johnny. And these things are remarkably astute, accurate, observant. He was someone who was fascinated with what was before him. And when he went to do his mural work, it was amazing how over about 10-year period, he was able to shift his way of working so that he moved from a more realistic, this is what I'm visually observing kind of thing, to a very flat, postery kind of thing that read from a distance better. Lots of detail becomes very difficult to view from a distance, and if you have a your artwork is hundreds of feet away, the detail, if the work depended on the detail, it's going to suffer, and he realized that. Hundreds of feet away, the detail, if the work depended on the detail, it's going to suffer, and he realized that. So there were things like that he grew throughout his entire life, his painting life. People don't realize he's so well known for the portraits. He was the standout portraitist of his day. Nobody denied that. And he stopped doing it about halfway through his painting career. People don't realize that for the last 20 years, he virtually did nothing. He did a couple that he was pressured into, and he would even put those off as long as possible. I think Rockefeller was one of them. Rockefeller could afford anything he wanted. He wanted Sargent. He wanted the best. Sargent said, no, I'm not doing that anymore. I've got some friends, DeLaslo and Zorn and others who'll do it for you. No, I want you. And so Sargent finally quoted him a price 3 times his normal portrait price. I think it was $100,000, and you can't even imagine what that is today. And J.D. said, okay, right away. And then when Sargent finally did do it 9 months later, Rockefeller wanted a copy made for the boardroom. And he said, absolutely not. And he got DeLaslo to do, I think it was DeLaslo, to do a copy. I have tried copying one of my own works shortly after school. It's the most boring thing you can imagine. The stimulation and excitement of working from life and then trying to copy your own work and remember the physicality of what you did during it. Sargent was an itinerant American. He didn't step foot on American soil till he was 20, and that was because he had to, or he was going to have to relinquish his citizenship. And when he did come here, he had relatives who had heard about, through the letters from the parents, this young, talented, and so he was doing portraits of the family and whatnot. And over the next decade or so, he had a strong connection with Boston and did many portraits and cultivated a relationship with Isabella Stewart Gardner, and if you've ever been to Boston, you've probably heard about the museum there, that she left. She left specific instructions that it's never to be rehung, never to be changed. It's perfect, and they've been very good about that, with one famous exception in the 80s. I think it was in the 80s, when somebody broke in and stole a Rembrandt and a couple of others, still unrecovered. Rembrandt's, I think it was the Seascape. But I went out there, enjoyed myself very much, but there's a beautiful portrait, a standing portrait that he had done of her, and she hired all of the great portraitists of the day to do her portrait, and it terrified them. She was not picturesque, apparently, and they all wanted to flatter her, and Sargent scraped it off a dozen times. You know, he really wanted this one to work out, and just finally did one straight on. And she's standing there with her hands clasped and beautiful arms and a wonderful string of pearls and a beautiful figure. And he had taken the pattern on this large, I think it was an Oriental rug, and had enlarged it and used that for the background. So it was a very dramatic looking thing, but he couldn't figure out how not to do her just straight on, so he did it, and apparently her husband's reaction was something like, looks just like her, but damn queer as a whole, or something like that. Zorn, on the other hand, decided to do an extremely dramatic lighting, had her arms out in a doorway and this yellow light flooding up, probably the brand new incandescent light that had just come out, and decided to do a big flourish of color and drama to try and not do a straight portrait. But Sargent had a great teacher in Carolus Duran. He got his technique of painting from him. Sargent was an accomplished teenager when he came into Duran's studio, and Duran's only comment after looking at his portfolio and accepting him into the class was much to unlearn. And it took me a while as a teacher to figure that out. A lot of times we get in some bad habits, and those bad habits have been moderately successful, and because we're all so afraid to let go of some kind of success, that it is difficult to then move on, because you have to backtrack and fail in your mind, fail on the canvas. Yeah, and I've prided myself on the fact that if I'm going to fail, I want it to be a header into the concrete. You went off the diving board and there was no water in the pool at all. It was bad, and everyone knows it. The thing about a header into the concrete is that you can figure out what's wrong because it's obvious. When something is subtly wrong, it's very difficult. You keep staring at it and you can't figure out what's wrong with it. Well, this is the kind of thing that Sargent was good at. He could stop, mentally bring himself back from what he was doing, reorganize his thought process, and scrape the canvas back to nothing and start again. Oftentimes, models for portraits would think that the portrait was almost done, and they'd come in and the canvas would be slashed or just wiped off completely, because he did not want them to try and talk him into, oh, just finish it a little bit, it's fine. He had his standards that were far above everyone else's. There was nobody who could help him with his work at a certain point. He even remarked about his teacher later. He thought that Duran hated him. I think Duran was just extremely French, which made it very difficult for him, possibly as an American, to relate to. I'm not sure, but Sargent's comment about his teacher's work was, as he came up to an exhibition, he was talking with someone. Oh, this must have been a student of Carolus's, and his comment was he could teach it very well. He couldn't do it very well, and Duran was one of the top portrait artists on the continent before Sargent came along and kind of stole his thunder. Probably gave him thunder by mentioning that he was his teacher. Sargent started out with watercolor. It was the great love of his life for most of his painting career. During his portrait time, which I would say was from, let's round it out to 1890 to 1907, which was when he just said, that's it, I'm not doing it anymore. And so 17 years out of a 70-year life is not, doesn't seem like a big percentage, but what he packed into there was amazing. I've seen exhibits of his work, and I'm still finding new ones. Hundreds of commissioned portraits. Nobody had this kind of work. And he insisted on working from life, even though photography, was fairly prevalent during most of his career. He was asked by the king to paint the coronation, and he said, "No, I'd be in the way." The king, I think the king meant to do it from photographs, and Sargent was thinking, "Oh, I'm not going to be able to set up an easel right in the middle of a coronation." Oh, hold on. His insistence on working from life was not being, a problem child here. It was, especially at the time, you were going to miss things in the photography, and you were never going to have the same experience working from life as you would from photography. So he insisted on working from life, and his sitters had to come and sit. And it was, he had them packed so tightly. He would have a 9-month portrait season, and he would schedule every 2 weeks. A grand portrait would be done in those 2 weeks, maybe a few charcoals or something in between. But he would mercilessly scrape off as he was working along, again, because it's his standard. I think I went 6 months. It was the last day of my first semester at the American Academy, where I went to school, before I scraped one off. I finally had so much that was wrong with it. I was like, I can't fix this. And as soon as I was scraping it, a relief came over me. I realized, oh, this is why he scraped, to get rid of this horrendous tension. And because I always put my current problems on what Sargent was dealing with, which was funny, because at first I thought that he scraped it off because the drawing was off. He hadn't gotten a likeness, and then I could get my drawing and a likeness pretty easily, and I'm like, well, he's a lot better than me, so that can't be the problem. So then I put it on values, and then I put it on color, and then composition, and I finally settled on what I think was a big reason why he was scraping off. He was getting the model into the right mindset, not himself. You sit before this great figure of a man smoking his stogie, and he's got his palette out there, and he's observing you. And this must be incredibly intimidating. If any of you have sat up there, it's intimidating just having strangers. Can you imagine if you were alone with somebody who is, you know, the premier artist of the day, certainly one of them. And it took a while, but then I look at the faces that he painted, and these people were relaxed. I could tell because I've done open studio thousands of times, and I've had many in my studio one-on-one. And in my studio, the model and I are talking the entire time. In school, that was a distraction. When anybody talked, everybody had to be serious. Even when Richard Schmid was at the Palette and Chisel and I was painting with him, it was classical music, and nobody had any conversations. This was serious time. But it's very different for me. The first time that I talked with a model and was able to capture the facial expression of someone who's interested in what's going on instead of sitting there staring at a blank spot on the wall. I mean, how many times have we seen the school studies or the open studio studies where someone is staring off into space and they've got that blank look, that soulless look. I hate capturing that. I'm good at it. I can capture what's in front of me. And if the person up on the model stand, if their mind is just gone, you know, if they're just sitting there, I'll capture that. And it's still a very useful thing to come to Open Studio, even when that's there, because you're studying lots of other things, paint handling, color, all sorts of things. But if you're a portraitist and you're commissioned to do something, that's the last expression that you want, is this detached thing, and I see it all the time. The one I see most prevalent today is, I've got a camera pointed at me, because that's a totally different look. This is this isn't a relationship of what's going on between the artist and the sitter. And this is what Sargent did so brilliantly. You look at these people and they have lives, especially the women. They're not just pretty addendums to a picture, which was what portraiture was at the time. He gave them personalities and intelligence, and he did wonderful things. And I can tell that he was talking with the models, you know, these people the whole time. And I remember in school enjoying the silence because they're not moving, which means I can measure everything. And basically you're treating a person like a still life object, which is disrespectful now. In school, that was expected. It was the height of everything. If you treated a person like a still life object and you drew it perfectly, that was great. And that's what school's about. They're not there to teach you. This particular school of mine was not there to teach you to be an artist. It was there to teach you to be a draftsman, to be a painter. If you're going to be an artist, you're going to do that anyway. And if you graduated from the American Academy of Art, you knew skills. You knew how to draw. That's what Sargent got out of not only Duran, but he was going to the École des Beaux-Arts at the time, the fine arts, the Fine Arts Academy in Paris. And his family had carefully chosen this because, like I said, they were itinerant. He was born in Florence or Nice, somewhere in northern Italy, and the family moved around seasonally, moved north in the summer and south in the winter, and rented out places for months at a time. And some of his childhood friends he kept for a lifetime from this time. One of them became the writer, Vernon Lee. Her name was Violet Paget. And he had cousins, the Curtises, and a few others that would accompany them sometimes. But Sargent would always be out drawing and painting. All of them, would say there was very little he was interested in. Uh, his father had hoped for a military career, a naval career, or something like that, but quickly realized it wasn't going to work out. They were able to continue traveling, not because they were so rich, but they had an income. The father was a doctor, and he had written a book in the 1850s, mid or late 1850s, on amputation. Well, if you know anything about American history, immediately after that came our Civil War. So there was an income that came from this, and they were able to travel. Well, Mrs. Sargent she thought that America was, the backwoods, thought that Europe was the height of everything, and decided that in her mind that they were never going to go back. And so she would become ill when it was time to go home, or pregnant, or something would distract them and keep them there. And Mr. Sargent is thinking he's gonna get home this year, and didn't quite make it. So he had the perfect childhood, home education, out painting every day. His mother was a decent landscape painter in watercolor, and he and his sister both learned to do this, that it was a normal thing. And it still kind of is. The average Brit, my age, can do a decent watercolor because they all did it in school. They all learned how to watercolor. Not something done here. I was amazed at people who did these watercolors. They'd show them to me. Oh, this is what I did when I was young or in high school or whatever. And I'm like, these are pretty good, And they said, oh no, and it wasn't false modesty. They just realized that this was just the education that they had. They could set up and paint what was in front of them in watercolor and represent it. So this was the life that Sargent grew up in, except he elevated it, obviously. His watercolors were probably the love of his life. If he had to do one thing in his life, it probably would have been to paint watercolors. And it's hard to imagine because he was so brilliant handling paint. Even among the great painters of his day, he was known as the brush man, the man who knew how to lay paint on canvas. It's easy. I used to always say it's much more fun to watch Tiger Woods. Obviously, this is an old reference. Sink that 60-footer than it is to watch me hit the ball 17 times on the putt and finally get it in the hole. That's how I feel about painting. I really like to see that 60-footer. I like to see that brushstroke that says so much, rather than somebody who's knuckle painting and beating up a piece of paint until it has no personality at all. Just I watch people do this on a canvas, and Sargent would be 10 feet away from the canvas with his palette in his arm, looking at his subject and deciding what's the next brushstroke, and then when he has run that through his mind several times, making all the mistakes in his mind instead of on the canvas, he would then walk up and make that brushstroke and then come back and evaluate it. I forgot the evaluate part for a long time when I was young. I assumed everything I was putting down was wonderful. So that was the great thing about that day that I scraped. I suddenly realized that I was leaving things that were okay on the canvas. They weren't great though, and there was no reason to leave them on the canvas if they weren't great. Every time you touch the canvas, it should be with purpose. That's the kind of painter I wanted to be, and that's the kind of painter that Sargent was. There were some painters who came before him who had the same attitude, who worked out techniques of painting that made sense. Probably the first, earliest would be Frans Hals, Hals. Dutch painter, contemporary of Rembrandt. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like in the Netherlands with these tremendous painters all around the same time, Vermeer, and you know. But Hals wanted to capture that facial expression, that I'm not just staring at a spot on the wall across the room, but the interaction, the I've got a living, breathing person here with emotional expressions and things inside that they want expressed on the outside. And so he simplified his painting technique to the absolute necessity, only what was necessary. He reduced the colors on his palette. You see all the beautiful colors we have on our palette. I've seen up to, 40, 50 colors. I think it's amazing. The people who understand drawing and values, and most importantly, temperature of a light source, what they can do with a few colors rather than somebody with 50, 60 colors and always reaching in and never being able to remix a color because they've got 7 or 8 different colors in there. It would be trying to make a recipe of a soup that you've put 30 things in and you never measured anything. And then you want to, oh, wow, this is perfect. I need to do it this way every time. So a simplified palette was what Hals decided made sense. And you see this later with Sargent's contemporary, Zorn. You hear about this famous Zorn palette. It's basically black, white, a yellow, and a red, and maybe a couple of other blues and greens to throw in that might not be available as an admixture from those simple colors. Hals, if you look at his color, it's adequate. There's nothing wrong with it. You would never look at it and say, wow, it needs color. It's fine. And yet his palette was very simple because he figured out how to create form from a light source in 5 values. 3 to the light, 2 to the shadow. This was his way of working. He looked at a solid object and, a sleeve, a hand, a finger, a nose, and he was able to recreate the look of that with these 5 simple values. When you do that, they become very easily brushstrokes, something that you lay down because it's representing what's up there. You're not trying to show the smoothness of a baby's cheek by killing that brushstroke till it has no personality. You're turning it into a value of a particular size and shape, and that's drawing. With a particular temperature. If you're dealing with north light, it's a cool light and a warm shadow. We've got sunlight out here today creating the opposite, warm light, cool shadow. So if you understand how to deal with temperature in a rather simple way, then color becomes something that is a nice decoration, but it's not the structure that the piece was made from, like a Monet or something like that, or a Cézanne. So Franz Hals was the epitome of this slashing brushstroke, this lay it down. One of the things that I noticed in my work when I was in school, when I was first learning oil painting, was there's a particular mark when you make a stroke and you stop and you lift the brush up. And it's a real ugly mark. I call it the ugly mark because it's the moment of hesitation. When you make that brush stroke and stop, think, okay, I think that's just about right, and then you lift up, the paint just gets all textured at the end of that brush stroke instead of the beauty of the beginning of the brush stroke. Your thought was good in the beginning, and it was okay here, and then you kind of panicked at the end here. Sargent never had the ugly mark at the end of his brush stroke. Neither did Franz Hals. That brush was moving, struck the canvas, made its shape, and was moving as it left. It's an amazing thing to see. And then I was able to see Richard Schmid do that. He never had that ugly mark. Nikolai Feshin never had that ugly mark. Anders Zorn never had that ugly mark. And I went back and I looked at my own work, and I could see it. I then knew when I was afraid. So having, Richard referred to it, and Richard Schmid was the one who helped me get through a lot of this, partly because there was a Sargent show that came, the first major Sargent exhibition in 50, 60 years, because since World War I, before World War I, the Armory show and all of that, modern art became the thing, very fashionable. If you understood it, it was no good, and that kind of thing. So Sargent was out of fashion. He knew he was out of fashion. Probably before he finished at exactly the right time. But he quickly fell out of fashion. Oh, would I love to have a bag of money and go to an auction in the 1930s or 40s and buy Sargents for hundreds of dollars, and instead of $500,000 now. He was so out of fashion that no books were written. Nobody was copying his style. The real portrait art, the real painters, they were then calling them illustrators. Rockwell adored Sargent. He was Andrew Loomis adored Sargent because he had focus. He had understanding of what was happening. It wasn't just an emotional blurt. It was a skilled thing in there that was anchored by there was an atmosphere where the emotional part was allowed to flourish. That's what I like to set up on a model stand. I like to set up an atmosphere in a room where something is allowed to happen, and then a lot of times the thing that's being allowed to happen is coming from the model. And that's what I meant by Sargent was scraping off, waiting for his model to get ready. When they relaxed, when they did the hand gesture that was characteristic of them. You see a lot of portrait painters, especially the ones who work from photography, have no clue what to do with somebody's hands because they're only with that person for a photo session. And we're not used to, as soon as we know we're being recorded, suddenly we don't know what to do with our hands, okay? Every single one of you, I'm looking at your hands, and you're all doing something different. This is what I would be aware of when I'm painting figures, is what is your character in your body and your hands especially, secondary only to the face. he, I'm sure, had to do far less educating of the public because portraits were something that were done. In the Midwest here, they're not. Chances are, many of you have probably never walked into anyone's home and seen a family portrait, a painting done of someone. It's just not done. It's kind of done in New York, corporate circles mostly. In the South, they all want their pretty kids and all that. But in the Midwest, if you want to have a portrait career, and I learned this before I even got out of school, you're working at Six Flags. You know, you're doing 20-minute charcoals or pastels. But to actually do portrait work that's family portrait work, not the corporate stuff, you're gonna be hard pressed. People don't get the idea that well, I could buy a car for what that costs. Well, 10 years from now, that car likely going to be in the junkyard. The painting won't be. The painting will still be there, and it'll be it'll still be worth something, hopefully. But we don't think about it that way in the Midwest. I don't know why. I don't know how it happened, but it did. But I love painting people. There's nothing more fun than open studio for me. I just enjoy the variety. I enjoy not controlling everything. And I think Sargent had a beautiful portrait studio. And it was very functional for him, had a huge north skylight. Plus, London was fairly gray anyway, so you weren't getting the sunlight on the buildings across the way bouncing in and kind of ruining things. These things were huge and far away and diffuse, not like a spotlight that is, in school we had a halogen light that was on top of the model where you would have light fall off from a standing figure, that was nearly impossible to paint, and it was terrible. It looked like, it just looked very stagey. And then I went over to the Palette and Chisel, and they had a very nice skylight there, and things looked normal, and it was 12 feet wide, so you would get a nice soft transition from light to shadow. Very portraity, very Sargent-y looking sometimes. So Sargent would set up an environment and then work with that particular person. The person would come in with some kind, they say they don't, but I just want you to paint me. They have an idea of what they want. And I found that I can't please other people. I can't have that mindset while I'm painting that I'm trying to make you happy. Or even worse, I'm trying to make this sellable. I'm trying to make my gallery happy. I'm trying to find a buyer for this. I can't do that. And I realized that I was going to have a great deal of difficulty with a career with that attitude. You can't just paint for yourself all the time. Vermeer did. Others did, and did beautiful work. They may not have been popular or understood particularly in their time, but you really understood something about that person, that artist, their vision, especially if you got a chance to see a bunch of their work together. But Sargent learned how to navigate that. He felt the pressure, make me beautiful, make me taller, make my fingers longer, but he did it. He did it. Yeah, he did it very nicely. Even Andy Warhol, I remember hearing about an interview that he gave, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in Sargent's world where everybody was tall and elegant, and and I could just hear his soft voice saying that. And sometimes I look at those grand Sargent standing portraits and say, yeah, it would be kind of interesting. And you start doing the measurements and you're like, wow, this is an alien. This could not possibly be, but it looks gorgeous. It looks elegant. It looks wonderful.